talk about it. But here's two questions that came in last week. And then obviously it was somebody who was reading through a particular chapter in the New Testament, and they had lots of questions about that chapter. So it was Luke chapter 4. And the context of that chapter is this, at least the first part of it, is the account of when Jesus was tempted. Yep. And he goes through the whole temptations, the three temptations that the devil brings him. And many times in that passage, Jesus will say, Scripture says, and he will quote Scripture. And the question that the person asked their question is, what was he referring to when he says Scripture says? Had there been something written at that point, or was it a legend that had been passed down generation to generation? And their comment was, we think of Scriptures as the Bible, but I know there was no Bible yet. Mm-hmm. So what is Jesus referring to when he says, the Scriptures say? Who wants to grab that one?
He's referring to the Scriptures, the Old Testament. The Old Testament. The Old Testament, the 39 books of the Old Testament were, everybody at that time knew and had them. And the good thing is we know that they had them because in 1946, 7, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and people used to think a lot of the things that we count as Bible, and particularly the prophecies that people say, oh, that referred to Jesus, people would go, well, that was probably inserted in those 39 books after Jesus. And then they find these Dead Sea Scrolls that the most conservative, people who are, they want to put it as late as they can, they all say those scrolls are with 100 years before Jesus. Yes. Mm-hmm. And all the prophecies that we have about Jesus are in those scrolls. Mm-hmm. So we know they were reading, Jesus and his guys, there's one point where Jesus is in his hometown and they say they handed him the scroll.
Yeah, that's in that same chapter.
Yeah, okay. He's reading from the book of Isaiah, and it's exactly the same quote we have in the book of Isaiah.
Yep.
And it was what was in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there were, when you say there wasn't a Bible, there isn't a Bible like we have all 66 put together. That agreed. That was not put together until hundreds of years after Jesus, because it really, you can't carry around all the scrolls at one time. It just was the nature of their technology.
Yep.
And now I can have many translations on my phone.
Yes.
They couldn't carry all the scrolls at once, but now I can carry many translations on my phone.
And they had a collection that they had all agreed on were the ones that were inspired by God. And so when he ever referred to Scriptures, they knew what he was talking about.
Absolutely.
That there's these books, and like he said, Isaiah is all part of that, and all the prophecies. But then even all that we would consider in the Old Testament was part of that. So
and Orthodox Jews today even still hang on to those same ones. They've been their scriptures have been the same the whole time.
Yep. Mm-hmm. So short answer to that question, anytime you hear Jesus or anybody in the New Testament refer to the Scriptures, they're talking about the Old Testament that you know as the Old Testament today. They wouldn't have called it that, because it wasn't old to them.
It wasn't the Testament.
Was the Testament.
Testament means covenant. Yeah. It was the covenant.
That was our thing. So that's what he was referring to. Second question this same person asked is in that same chapter. Skip down to verse 25 in Luke 4. And that their question was that there's a statement in there that says the heavens were closed for 3.5 years, and they want to know what that means. So here's the context. Jesus goes into the synagogue in his hometown. He reads from the book of Isaiah, the scroll there, and then he makes the statement that, this has been fulfilled in front of you. And he's basically saying, hey, when Isaiah wrote that hundreds and hundreds of years ago, he was talking about me. And it was kind of a shocking thing to the folks in his hometown. In fact, in some translations, they go back and forth on this, but the word that they use there was they were really shocked when he said that, knowing that he was the carpenter's son, and basically saying, well, I know this kid, he grew up down the street. And so then Jesus goes into this whole thing where he starts talking to the people in his hometown, and he's saying, this is normal. When a prophet goes back to his own place and they know him, they tend to not accept him. And he said, this is why it's going to, and then he gets into this other part where he's talking about this is why there are going to be a lot of you that think you are in with God in this new kingdom that is breaking onto the scene, and you're going to be left out. And then he uses several examples from the Old Testament of when that happened. And one of those examples is where he makes this statement. He talks about this story where the prophet Elijah, they're experiencing a drought and a famine during this time in history. And he says he could have gone to anybody in his own among his own people in his hometown to save or to help. But he winds up with this foreign lady somewhere else who's way outside of the Israelite tradition, and he went to her. And he's making a point to them that you're going to miss out, and there are going to be people outside of this family that are going to get in. And then he makes that statement, when the heavens were closed for 3.5 years. So that's the question that they're asking. What was Jesus talking about? And I think it's pretty plain from the context. He's talking about,
if you know the story of Elijah, which I thought you were just going to go ahead and tell them the rest of the story.
Well, the rest of the story is there was no rain for 3.5 years, and then, long story short, Elijah prays, and God opens the flood or the rain clouds, and it rains. So
because they have, we don't typically refer to the sky as the heavens. Some people still do, but in their their language, when they referred to heavens, it actually referred to multiple different layers. Obviously, so it's interesting. I have a child named Heaven, and so anytime we sing any song that says heaven, they're heaven. They're very confused. What? And so, so anytime that kind of thing gets mentioned, but yeah, it's the same kind of thing. I'm trying to explain to me. Yeah, well, there is the heaven that this is kind of God's realm, that He made the heavens and He made the earth, but He also made the heavens, which is the sky. And so some translations just, instead of saying the heavens weren't open, they said the skies wouldn't open. But what they mean is, in particular, the rain, the atmosphere.
Yes, the atmosphere. Well, in the Jewish tradition, there was 3 levels. There was the first heaven, which is the air that we live in right now that you're breathing. They would call that the first heaven. The second heaven is what they would see in the night sky up above us, and the greater atmosphere that surrounds our earth. And then they would call the third heaven the place where God lives. And so that's why you hear in one of Paul's letters, he talks about having a vision. He says, I was caught up into the third heaven. He means I was with God.
Right.
And that's what, so when you hear that kind of language in the Jewish tradition, that's what they would refer to as heaven and earth. They might be talking about just the air.
The sky,
The sky. So,
which the first time I remember hearing it, it just was mind-blowing to me that in the Lord's Prayer, when Jesus says, our Father who art in heaven, He intentionally uses the first one, which had to be mind-blowing to them because, God's in the third heaven, and Jesus says, I want you to pray to the Father who is as close as the air all around you. He's not far off. He isn't somewhere else. He's right here with you. And I remember, in fact, even talking about it now, I get goosebumps because just that idea, God's not far away. He's not somewhere that I have to call out and I have to pray in a certain way. He's really, really, really close.
Yes. All right. So I hope that answers your question, whoever it was that sent that in. Thanks for that one. That was pretty simple. That was easy for me to handle. Sometimes we've gotten some really complicated stuff.
But I can see where it was complicated.
Me too.
If you haven't read the Old Testament or you haven't read it much or you don't know, and there's a lot, I would just say to people, if you don't know the Bible, don't start in the Old Testament. I mean, we're Jesus followers, not Old Testament followers. Start with Jesus. Get to know Jesus.